I chose to research literature that focuses on jazz improvisation pedagogy. I sought to review and classify the methods used to teach jazz improvisation, examining historical trends in works spanning almost 60 years. The end result of this research would be the creation of a research project to evaluate the effectiveness of individual and combined pedagogical methods for teaching jazz improvisation utilizing computer-aided instruction. I began my research by reviewing popular methods used and discussed in the jazz community that focus on teaching improvisation. Works chosen for review included general jazz pedagogy books that comprehensively discussed the task of improvising jazz, along with texts that focus on more specific topics, such as jazz theory, patterns, or pianists from a certain era. What brings these works together is not only their focus on teaching the improvisation, but also the methods employed to do so. There are 5 general instruction methods that jazz texts have adopted to teach jazz improvisation. Each of these 5 approaches provides a framework upon which the student would base their improvisational ideas. They are scales and modes, harmonic or chordal ideas, melodic embellishments, patterns, and example transcriptions. These 5 methods can be further split into 2 schools, one classical and another could be considered modern. For example, the classical school would base improvisation on the harmony of a piece or a scale, while the modern school would employ patterns and example transcriptions. Perhaps the most effective texts offer multiple approaches from both schools, as both modern jazz improvisation textbooks have adopted this combined approach. The scalar approach is one of the most popular methods for framing the topic of jazz improvisation. Historically important jazz texts from the 50s and 60s by Baker, Coker, and Slonimsky focus on scales as they progress as the primary mode with which to examine improvisation. Another mode of discussing improvisation that is classical in nature is to follow a harmonic or chordal approach. This method utilizes the chord progression to create a structure for improvisational ideas. Russell's jazz theory text from 1959 was one of the first jazz books to exclusively focus on harmony derived from the Lydian mode to generate ideas. The previously mentioned work from Coker also utilizes harmonic concepts. The popularity of the scalar and harmonic methods for teaching jazz improvisation in the 50s and 60s was reinforced by a review of jazz improvisation courses offered at over 100 colleges in 1971. Many of the professors interviewed were using the Coker book for the first semester and the Russell text for their second semester jazz improvisation courses. Other texts to utilize harmony as the basis for creating improvisations would include many of the books in the popular Aebersold play-along series. Each of Aebersold's popular play-along series reinforces his reliance on classical approaches to improvisation. The basic ingredients in music are scales and chords. Ferrara's work was also reviewed, and note palettes was found to be particularly interesting. The key to this is finding a scale that a chord is based on. The author's term note palette combines both of the classical approaches to improvisation using chord tones and connecting scale tones to provide a platform to improvise from. Another interesting feature of Ferrara's text is his study of melodic embellishment within the context of jazz improvisation. The classification of improvisation techniques can generally be split between classical and modern techniques. An example of classical improvisational technique is theme and variations, termed call and response in blues, gospel, and rock music. Melodic embellishments has been used in both modern and classical improvisations. A focus on patterns as a mode for framing jazz improvisational ideas is a more modern concept. The late 60s saw the emergence of published jazz pedagogical material stressing above all else the mastery of patterns. Prominent among these were publications of David Baker and Jamie Aebersold, the 2 most prolific producers of jazz study materials to date. Baker, Coker, Laverne, and Slonimsky's work are compendiums of patterns with scant text. These collections provide the improviser with a vocabulary of learned patterns to utilize in their improvisations. They are generally organized by scale type or chord progression, further obscuring the lines between the classical and modern approaches. Another trend in modern jazz pedagogical literature is a reliance on example transcriptions. A second text from Levine features a heavy emphasis on example transcriptions throughout, illustrating concepts with actual transcriptions from important jazz musicians' recordings. Example transcriptions instantly validate concepts and provide the student with a firm foundation on which to base their improvisatory ideas. Levine's book utilizes 4 of the 5 approaches to frame improvisation: scales, patterns, harmony, and example transcriptions. Reeves's work is a popular textbook for college-level jazz improvisation classes that places even more importance on example transcriptions to reinforce concepts. Entire solos from major jazz artists like Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Lester Young, Clifford Brown, Milt Jackson, Wayne Shorter, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, and many others reinforce the concepts of each chapter. Merging the concepts of scales, patterns, and harmony with specifically chosen example transcriptions illustrating these concepts, Reeves gives the student of jazz improvisation a lot to think about. Combining instructional methods to frame improvisational ideas offers the improviser more options and perhaps the ability or awareness to be able to consider them simultaneously. Combining methods of teaching improvisation provides the student with more options for improvisatory ideas. An effective trend in recent jazz literature is to combine at least 3 or 4 of the defined methods. For example, Levine's short work on drop 2 piano voicings manages to utilize pattern, scales, and harmony to discuss improvisation. Valerio's book is the only one in this review that manages to combine all 5 of the approaches to improvisation: scales, patterns, harmony, melodic embellishments, and example transcriptions. What also makes this book unique is that Valerio chooses 5 modern jazz pianists to study in detail: Bill Evans, McCoy Tyner, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and Keith Jarrett. Each pianist has an entire chapter where their style is analyzed using the 5 approaches to framing improvisation: scales and modes, patterns, harmony and chordal ideas, melodic embellishments, especially in the Keith Jarrett chapter with regards to thematic reference, and example transcriptions. In addition to reviewing popular literature that teaches jazz improvisation, we reviewed articles that assess the effectiveness of the various pedagogical methods. Although a bit dated, Whitmore and Robbins' brief history and practical evaluations of jazz improvisational material is thorough and informative. While this journal article came up with more approaches to analyzing the materials, their conclusion matched those presented here. The authors encouraged the inclusion of phrasing, melody, rhythm, and information about how to listen, topics that would have made our short list of 5 methods of instruction had there been any evidence for them in our literature review sample. Bash and Kuzmic come to similar conclusions, urging future researchers to gauge the effectiveness of improvisational instructional treatments. The work agrees with the conclusions presented here, pointing to research that suggests combining multiple approaches to improvisation instruction was superior to the more traditional approach, emphasizing technical concerns. A rather critical review of doctoral research relating to jazz improvisation pedagogy has more reserved interpretations of the reviewed research than other documents reviewed here. The author essentially throws out the conclusions of each of the dissertations he reviews, while finally conceding that recommendations could be made to enhance our understanding of teaching jazz improvisation if the research done was held to higher standards than those projects he reviewed. Further exploration of subskills associated with jazz improvisation thus remains a crucial and exciting prospect. The respective influences of imitation, singing, listening, analysis, and transcription deserve further investigation. Rhythm should play a bigger role in improvisation pedagogy, according to celebrated bassist Dave Holland. Popular saxophonist Joe Lovano also agreed with the assessment of the benefits of blending approaches from classic and modern schools of thought to jazz improvisation pedagogy. To conclude, there were other important jazz improvisational techniques that none of these texts reviewed. I assume that these methods were considered too difficult by the authors to explain: rhythm, phrasing, dynamics, etc. There is a growing library of excellent pedagogical resources for teaching jazz improvisation. Most sources agree that instruction that combines classical and modern approaches will be the most effective, although there is little research to support this claim. More research should be done in this area to determine what are the optimal techniques for teaching jazz improvisation. In addition to researching the effectiveness of teaching techniques, I recommend the solicitation of feedback from both prominent and local jazz musicians. Interviews should be conducted with jazz musicians to gain insight into which pedagogical techniques provided the biggest gains to their own improvisational skills.